Raghuram Rajan, former Governor, Reserve Bank of India, is our guest. Thank you very much, Raghu, for joining us. Well, 10 years on, we appear to meet once again when emerging markets are looking like on the verge of a crisis. Look at their currencies. Turkey year-to-date down 40%, Argentinian peso down 49%, South African rand and Brazilian real down 18%, and the Indian rupee down 13% year-to-date. Does it look like we are on the verge of something ugly for emerging markets?
Well, it's hard to say. I think the Argentinian and Turkish case are special. They have had a history of problems. And this has come to the fore recently. It does signify some concern for other emerging markets. This is not a good time to abandon macro stability. You have to focus on reassuring markets that you are good for it. And unfortunately, countries that have growing current account deficits, that have large fiscal deficits, look particularly vulnerable at these times.
Well, how worried should we be about India's current account deficit and trade deficit? The last July number, trade deficit number, was as high as 18 billion. And at that pro rata rise in trade deficit, it could be 3% current account deficit.
Yes, it's that, and you also have a large fiscal deficit. Of course, the center has been relatively moderating, but the states have increased their fiscal deficit, and when you aggregate government fiscal deficit, it is quite large. I think the fact that India is growing quite strongly gives it some positive. But in general, I think we have to pay attention. Now, the current account deficit is partly a result of oil prices going up, but it's also partly a result of our export sector having been hit by the twin shocks of demonetization as well as the GST. We need to do everything on a war footing to get the export sector back up and running. Of course, the depreciation in the rupee thus far will help, but I think it's also important to focus on the impediments that hold it back to make sure that we are signaling to the markets that we're in the process of bringing down the current account deficit. It also means that we have to be very careful on the fiscal front. We cannot afford an election year budget going forward, given the kind of turmoil that there is there in financial markets. It has to be a responsible one.
Okay. Well, so you're speaking in terms of cures that the rupee depreciation should help, but we should try and do more for the export sector and keep a very sharp eye out on macros like fiscal deficit. But what about needing instruments like interest rate hike, which we had to resort to in 2013, or even something like this special NRI bond, the FCNRB scheme? Will it come to that?
Well, I think those are always weapons you have in the armory. But I think it's important, and this is one place where we've made a very important move since the last crisis. It's very important that the RBI continue to signal, as it has done so far, its concerns about keeping inflation on track, about raising interest rates whenever appropriate to fulfill its inflation objective. That gives investors confidence that the rupee is not going to go into free fall, because ultimately inflation will be under control and the rupee can get significantly undervalued if it continues falling at these rates.
So basically stick to good macros as the Reserve Bank has been doing. Okay, Raghu, let me get your views on the global economy as well. Are there any red flags? I mean, the emerging market currencies, some of them are wobbly, including the rupee to some extent, much lesser than the others. But should we worry about the global ambience as well? After all, there are tariff wars, trade wars, and they don't seem to be ending anytime soon. Can these conflagrate into a crisis?
Well, I think we have two big sources of vulnerability that have built up. One, of course, is the leverage that has built up across the globe, not just in flows to emerging markets, but also within industrial countries. There are sectors that have become very highly levered. For example, in the US, the shale industry is highly levered. In certain other countries, Australia, the housing sector is highly levered. So pockets of leverage have built up across the world, just as they had before the global financial crisis. So that's the source of one source of vulnerability. The second important source of vulnerability is policy. As you just pointed out, trade, there are big questions over it. That tends to dampen cross-border investment, but it also creates an adverse effect on sentiment. Couple these together, and what you have going forward is the possibility that suddenly, when a country is vulnerable, you have an additional political shock which comes from the trade side. That's a volatile mix. Now, on top of all this, we have interest rates rising. The employment numbers that came out on Friday for the United States suggest that US growth is strong and inflation is picking up, which means the Federal Reserve will continue raising interest rates over the next few quarters. So if you put this mix together, it is basically suggesting that times are going to get tighter going forward, especially for highly leveraged entities. And we'll come to know where those problems are as we go forward.
Okay. Well, some analysts earlier today, when we were discussing the rupee at 72.50, were pointing out that at the moment emerging markets have a kind of double whammy. Last time when the Fed was raising rates, it was, that is 2003 to 2007, the US economy was doing well and Asian economies could export to it. Now they have the negatives of the US economy doing well, which is a strong dollar and higher Fed rates, but they can't export as much because of the tariff war. Does this make EMs particularly vulnerable, and will that be the source of problems?
It makes them more vulnerable. I think this is a big source of uncertainty because many countries export to China and via China to the US. And this includes Latin America, it includes much of East Asia. Of course, India is different because it's more of a self-contained economy. But these are sources of vulnerability. And unfortunately, there is very little confidence that the US administration fully recognizes all these interlinkages and that it actually worries about the effects, the feedback effects, as the emerging markets slow. Now, the reality is much of world growth now is driven by the emerging markets. So the industrial world cannot be decoupled from growth in the emerging markets. We need both to grow if the industrial countries are to do well. We have an illusion, a temporary illusion, that the industrial countries are growing and growing strongly, and it doesn't depend on the growth in emerging markets. That's an illusion that will crack if, in fact, the emerging markets slow considerably.
Okay. These kinds of instabilities and trade tariff wars are coming at a time when US asset prices, stock market prices are very high, and so are Indian stock market prices. Are these particularly vulnerable?
Well, this is a consequence, in part, in the US of the added stimulus through the tax reforms, but also the still accommodated level of interest rates. US interest rates, despite growth being 4% plus in the last quarter, are still, the policy rate is pretty much zero at this point given inflation. So in real terms. So what this is saying is that the monetary policy rates will have to go up. And of course, that has a dampening effect on asset prices as we look forward. The broader point, I think, is this is something I've been saying pretty much since 2009, is that monetary policy cannot be the answer to all problems. And in the West, unfortunately, it has stayed very low for very long. It has built up vulnerabilities. And now, as it normalizes, we are seeing the consequences of those vulnerabilities come about. This is unfortunately a consequence of the very low interest rates over a long period of time.
Well, time permitting, I will come back to the Lehman crisis and what ghosts we are still battling. But I want to look at India, the impact on India of the Lehman crisis. Some people in our series, Lehman Crisis 10 Years On, have looked at India's NPA crisis today as a sequel to the Lehman crisis, consequence of the exuberance which we did not recognize at that time. Would you say so?
Well, I think there are elements. I won't put the entire blame on Lehman. It is true that in 2007, 2008, we were essentially being driven in part by a very strong world economy. And because of the substantial growth in India, I think bankers were optimistic, promoters were optimistic. The last run of projects had worked very, very well. And so they started a whole new set of projects. And as is the tendency at these times, with more leverage, less equity, more optimism about the future, turns out the future wasn't as rosy as the past. So the crisis in the West played a part. But also, to some extent, in India itself, we had three rounds of fiscal stimulus after the crisis hit, which helped create the illusion that growth was still strong, while, of course, the underlying factors that drove growth had slowed considerably. And that also helped eventually slow down projects that were underway. And many of these projects from 2007, 2008, 2009 have slowed. Because of the overall slowness in the economy, plus, of course, a variety of other factors such as governance.
Oh, yes. We understand that the Estimates Committee, Parliament's Estimates Committee approached you to get your views on the causes and the causes of the NPAs and the way forward. And I believe that you have identified bankers' over-optimism as one reason, but also incompetence and corruption. How much would you worry that bankers may have been in cohorts with promoters?
Well, I think it's very hard to say without actually investigating in more detail. And my worry is we tend to look at one-off situations, a loan going bad. Well, bankers have to exercise business judgment. And if the overall economic environment is one of optimism, they get infected by that. The fact that a loan goes bad when it is made under such circumstances doesn't necessarily signify corruption or even incompetence. It could signify the general expectation is of strong growth. I don't think bankers should be faulted for that. The real problem comes, however, that when you have identified loans going bad, you should work very hard to either put them back on track or essentially get out if you can. That process hasn't worked well in India. The exuberance, the bad loans, that's something other countries have also experienced. But the cleanup, both by the bankers' side as well as the support given by government agencies and so on, hasn't worked as effectively.
Well, would you, we are now pinning a lot of hope on the bankruptcy code and the NCLT process. At least two big defaulters have been brought to book and checks have been written by new promoters to the bankers. Are you now more confident that the stock of defaulters, the stock of bad loans will be resolved sometime soon?
Well, first, I have a more detailed note on my website, and that's my reply to the Parliamentary Estimates Committee, and people could look at that directly for a more detailed view. But really, I think the bankruptcy court is a very important, useful development, but we have to see how it plays out. Remember, when SARFAESI was brought in, when the debt recovery tribunals were brought in, there was a lot of anticipation that these would resolve previous debt problems. And very soon the courts got clogged in appeals, counter appeals, and essentially recovery started dropping very quickly after the initial successes. It is very important that we make sure that the bankruptcy courts don't succumb to that very same process, which means that they have to deal with high value items, a relatively small number, but much of the bankruptcy resolution has to take place out of court, with the shadow of bankruptcy essentially acting as an ultimate threat for promoters and bankers who don't get their act together. It is not the place of the bankruptcy court to deal with every single situation of distress. If we try and do that, there is simply not enough capacity in the system to handle that, and we will find we're back to square one.
Okay, well, I guess many people are trying to resolve problems before they go to the NCLT, but the Reserve Bank has now made it practically mandatory that all loans above 2,000 crore, if stressed and not resolved for 6 months, should go to the NCLT. That's not the way to go. You think it can clog the NCLTs?
Well, I think the point here is to give some time for people to try and resolve their problems and to essentially make sure it's not indefinite. And I think you can pick the time that you give, but ultimately there has to be a threat. If they don't resolve it, then it goes to the final sort of showdown. So I think what we have to hope is much of the resolution gets done outside. Bankers sign on to it, the promoters bring in equity, we get the projects back on track rather than leave them languishing. That will be beneficial to the country and to its growth. And in the meantime, the NCLT deals with a few really tough cases.
Okay. Well, I have the link that you have on your website, and it's a 17-page reply to the Estimates Committee. I'll try and get to some more questions from that note, but before that, you know, in this series, Lehman crisis and the bill that India has to pay, I spoke with Dr. Subbarao as well, and he kind of agreed that yes, the Reserve Bank's forbearance, regulatory forbearance could have been responsible for exacerbating the NPA load later on. How would you look at the Rajan era itself? Would you have wanted to have done AQR earlier or done something different so that the load is not so big now?
Well, I think one always tries to justify oneself, but here's the situation with forbearance. Clearly, forbearance is a bet that somehow growth will allow NPAs to get resolved by themselves without action. And unfortunately, when the Reserve Bank initiated forbearance soon after the Lehman crisis, growth actually started deteriorating rather than picking up. There was a period over which forbearance was announced, and certainly in my time we stuck to that period. As soon as that period was over, we ended it. But it was important during that period to create ways that the bankers could actually move forward to resolve the NPAs. There's no point ending forbearance without them having any tools to essentially restructure the loans and put them back on track along with the promoters. And our sense then was that there were very few sort of levers that the bankers had over the promoters. So much of 2014 was spent trying to create those levers. So in fact, when we stopped forbearance, the bankers would actually have some ways to bring the promoters to the table and restructure those loans in an effective way. Remember, we didn't have the bankruptcy code then. We pushed for getting it done, but we simply didn't have that in place to restructure the loans. So an entire out-of-court restructuring, all these fancy names, S4, SDR, this, that, were put in place precisely to create an artificial bankruptcy code. In fact, with SEBI, we made it possible for the bankers to excise the promoter from the transaction if the promoter proved recalcitrant. Now, I think with the bankruptcy code, we have a more effective tool, but much of 2014, before the AQR was initiated, was spent trying to make sure the bankers had the means in which to resolve these bad debts.
Okay. Well, actually, now that your paper is in the public domain, I'm tempted to read out of it. You say that the size of frauds in public sector banking system have been increasing, though it is still a small part of the NPA load. And then you go on to say that you had sent a list to the PMO of the list of fraudsters so that there can be coordinated action. Could you get any action on that list?
Well, I don't know what has happened so far. The idea was that the 10 biggest fraudsters should be sort of identified, special action taken, so that if one or two are brought to justice, it sends a message. We will come after you. We will ensure that you will face penalties. Unfortunately, the tendency has been these things take a lot of time before they're labeled frauds. And once they label frauds, it takes forever to follow the money trail and to get anything that convinces foreign courts, because many of these guys have skipped the country and gone abroad, convinces foreign courts that there is a case at hand. So my worry is that a lot of frauds go unpenalized. Often the guys closest to the fraud, the bankers, are interrogated, sometimes imprisoned, sometimes rightfully. But the criminals on the other side typically get away scot-free, and this has to change. There has to be a sense that there will be punishment, otherwise we will see an escalating level of frauds.
Okay, it's taking time to get to this, all the 17 pages, but just one thing, if India has to avoid, okay, well, even before I come to if India has to avoid, is the worst over in terms of NPAs, or is this problem going to stick with us for a couple of years more to even just clear the stock?
Well, there are two things about the stock. First, as the stock ages and you haven't dealt with the problem, the NPAs rise because the provisioning for every loan that went bad keeps increasing with age. So there is some of that which takes place, a natural increase in the stock. Also, it's important that whatever new projects there are, they find a healthy environment and they grow. My sense is the slowdown in credit essentially implies that there will be relatively few projects to get into trouble. This is not good news. We do need far more investment. Sure, there will be NPAs from that investment, but hopefully at a much lower level if credit is sensible. But the fact that credit in general has slowed is a concern because it reflects concerns amongst bankers, amongst promoters about the overall economic environment, and that has to change for India to grow more strongly.